There you have it. Now, as we look at the world, I ended up with this pile of questions from this morning, tried to sort of consolidate some of the key issues. And there were probably 10 people that wanted you to talk a little bit more about Zimbabwe.
Okay. Let me go back to a little history. We got Mugabe to enter free and fair elections and to agree on a constitution that would not be changed for 10 years. That constitution gave whites 20% of the votes, even though they were 3% of the population. But part of that agreement was that the U.S. would give $75 million a year for land reform for 10 years. The British would give $1 billion for land reform, and that we would work together on a pattern of land reform to be started after 10 years. Nothing would change with land and the economy or the percentages in 10 years. The Constitution could not be amended for 10 years. They kept it for 10 years, and at the end of 10 years, people started raising questions about land reform. Now, you have to remember that in Africa, the land that was taken from people was taken in the 40s and 50s, much of it. In South Africa, some of it in the 60s and 70s. So it's not like us and the Indians. People are alive who remember living where there's now a government building. And they fought a war about getting their land back. So in 1990, after 10 years, Julius Nyerere and Kenneth Kaunda said, no, you can't raise the land reform question because it would jeopardize Mandela and ANC getting a settlement in South Africa. We have to take care of South Africa first. Then you can talk about land reform. Well, in the meantime, the U.S. didn't come up with money because Reagan reneged on that and Margaret Thatcher backed down on the British commitment. And so there was no money for land reform. The African leaders stopped them in 1990. By 2000, Mandela was out of jail. He had served his term, and Thabo Mbeki had been elected president. And so the soldiers came back to Mugabe again. What about our land? And he said, well, they took it from you, take it back. And they started this taking back land. Now, surprisingly, during that period, the year or so of transition, the actual numbers of people killed were around 200 people in 2 years. Only 12 of them white farmers. And most of the killing had been done in places, whites and blacks were killed not as a political threat, but they were killed as a result of quarrels and fights that spun off where everybody was drinking too much. And so it was a relatively peaceful transfer. Now, land reform should not be a problem in Zimbabwe. One landowner had 475,000 hectares of land. That's larger than Belgium. What Mugabe said was, you're not farming it, it's just sitting there, you really don't have any right to it, but we'll let you keep 275,000 hectares, but we need 200,000 to distribute amongst our farmers. Well, the landowner agreed. 275,000 hectares is more than 1 million acres. There's not a single landowner in the United States that owns 1 million acres in one place. And so there is enough land in Zimbabwe for everybody to have enough and for animals to be able to range free. And the problem with Zimbabwe is that if land reform is successful in Zimbabwe, they're going to want it in South Africa. And there isn't enough land in South Africa. I got married in South Africa to my second wife in the American Embassy, and I was riding by, and the young woman who runs the travel agency that was taking me to the airport, when we passed by the American Embassy, I said, I got married up there in the American Embassy. And she said, I grew up there. And she was about 40 years old. And I said, don't tell me your parents worked for those rich white folks. She said, hell no. She said, my father built that home. That was a home that he built out of his business, and they took it from us. And she was in her early 40s. And she remembered until, I said, how long did you live there? She said, I was about almost 15. Which means that, 25, 30 years ago and this was about, 5 or 6 years ago now. But that as late as for a 40, 50-year-old woman to remember growing up in a home that had been taken from her family. And I said, well, has the new government done anything to repatriate her? She said, they just give in the runaround. They're as bad as the other one. See? Now, the problem is that there just isn't enough land. There isn't enough money. And land reform would be a real problem in South Africa. So South Africa can't criticize Zimbabwe, because their own people are mad that there's no land reform. But the U.S. and Britain don't want Mugabe to succeed. But I don't think there's any way to stop it, because Mugabe is not hurting Zimbabwe. The U.S.-British embargo is hurting Zimbabwe. It's just like, is Castro hurting Cuba, or is the embargo hurting Cuba? If you didn't have an embargo on Cuba, Castro would have been changed or gone, and all of Cuba would have been doing better. The embargo does not hurt Mugabe. It hurts the people.